Thank you. I'm Jeff Gordon, and I have the pleasure of introducing the speaker today. The financial events have made goats of many and seers of few. Nouriel Roubini, to give a case, has become a noted figure because of his assertion that the crisis was not containable when others thought it might be. What? John Paulson, to take another example, has become seriously rich from his insight into the overvaluation of financial instruments associated with the housing bubble. These are the seers of few, I guess. The goats are too many to list. Today's speaker has not yet made it to Oprah's couch or become a zillionaire, but can claim remarkable insight into the riskiness of derivatives, beginning with a Yale Law Journal piece published more than 15 years ago. As a result, he is now the SEC's point person in the search for lurking risk in the financial system, a mission that he sometimes describes as the best job in Washington. Now, that's a strange taste, right? You've got to look out for undisclosed risk. The speaker is Henry Hu, and he is the director of a new division at the SEC, so-called Risk Fin, with a very broad mandate indeed. And I take some parochial pride in claiming Henry as a law professor, since he is at the SEC on leave from the University of Texas School of Law. The article that I referred to is about misunderstood derivatives. Seems like a psychoanalyst's account. There he outlines in a clear way why the banks came to know so little about the risks that they were exposing themselves to. And among the factors he identifies is that the banks were under pressure to innovate financial products that such that they underinvest in the effort to understand the risks, both to themselves and to the customers that buy the products. Then, too, the regulators are way behind the banks. Armed with this analysis, Henry then proposes some ideas about ways to, quote, turn on the lights by, among other things, the disclosure of how individuals are evaluated for purposes of compensation and advancement, including how a bank determines the proper risk-adjusted award for the traders. Now, as I say, this was written in 1993. This is very far-sighted indeed. And in addition to this pioneering work, Henry has called attention to the important governance issues of empty voting and empty creditors, phrases that he coined. So we very much look forward to Henry's insights of today.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I am the seriously poor Henry Hu. And the views I express are merely my own, not necessarily those of the SEC individual commissioners or any colleagues on the SEC staff. In the Woody Allen movie, Play It Again, Sam, Woody Allen sees an attractive woman, extremely attractive woman, at a museum who he'd like to meet. Allen. That's quite a lovely Jackson Pollock, isn't it? Woman. Yes, it is. Allen. What does it say to you? Woman. It restates the negativeness of the universe, the hideous, lonely emptiness of existence, nothingness, the predicament of man forced to live a barren, godless, eternity-like, a tiny flame flickering in an immense void with nothing but waste, horror, and depredation, forming a useless, bleak straitjacket in a black, absurd cosmos. Alan, what are you doing Saturday night? Woman, committing suicide. Alan, what about Friday night? The theme of this conference is extremely attractive as well. And both academics and government regulators are keenly interested in the subject. And in terms of this, I guess the basic theme of what I'm about to suggest is that, Woody Allen had the right approach. That is, to actually lower your sights a little bit, to go for an incremental approach. And I'm going to do this through the lens of three different sets of issues. First, why is this theme so attractive? And I'm going to look at it, and I basically argue that it's especially attractive in the area of complex financial products and other issues relating to financial innovation. Second, lens I want to talk about is, in a sense, this need for, or need is too strong a word, but that one should be fully cognizant of the virtues of incrementalism in terms of this area, in terms of, in fact, regulatory approaches generally. That is, that we ought to think about the virtues of kind of incrementalist regulatory approaches, such as in the area of compensation, and within compensation, be very careful, consider the virtues of measured steps, along with the negative aspects of this kind of incremental approach. And in terms of these two, first two sets of things, rely in part on that 1993 article that Jeff was kind enough to refer to, and also a 1989 University of Pennsylvania article. Third set of issues I want to very briefly talk about is some of the incremental steps the SEC has taken in this general area, broadly defined over the past few months. Okay. So, first, why is this theme so attractive? Well, in terms of, there are a whole variety of factors, right? I mean, the parts I managed to listen to were just fascinating. I love Jack's analysis. I thought it was just terribly, terribly thoughtful. And in terms of why, there are lots and lots of different reasons why we're interested in this theme. I mean, one is that there is clearly some kind of relationship between compensation, executive compensation, and excessive risk, right? And so in terms of means-end rationality 101, right, in a sense, you go to what seems to be the source, right? You try to figure out, hey, if that's the source of some of these issues, what should we do? And of course, a second factor, second among many, is just the dazzle of the number of zeros in terms of some of the compensation packages one sees, right? That there's an allure to them, that you want to basically gravitate to the light and look at what's going on. But I want to, instead of, in a sense, going through all the list of reasons, I want to focus on one aspect that I think, deserves some attention, perhaps some more attention. And that is, in terms of this area, because of the nature of the modern financial innovation process, by looking at, in a sense, this compensation area from a regulatory standpoint, may make more sense than in a lot of other areas, because it tends to conserve on information, that it recognizes the incredible asymmetry between what people on Wall Street or in the city are doing versus what people in Washington or at Canary Wharf know. And in terms of this asymmetry, let me be a little bit more specific. When you think of regulatory matters relating to financial innovation, the usual approach is to, for instance, focus on particular financial products and to figure out, hey, what should be done as to those particular financial products? And in terms of the usual lawyer or regulatory approach to anything, right, in terms of if there's intervention, well, the traditional approach, of course, is to set up some kind of classification system, a series of pigeonholes, right? So you figure out a particular product or a particular kind of behavior, a particular strategy, you slot it to a particular pigeonhole. And various kinds of regulatory or legal or other ramifications flow from the particular cubbyhole you stick it in, all right? Now, in terms of illustrating this point, in the kind of financial services space, or in particular in terms of derivatives, as you know, in 1989, when the first Basel Accord basically came into effect, largely motivated actually by OTC derivatives, in particular currency swaps and interest rate swaps. The regulators seemed especially concerned about the possibility of those kinds of OTC derivatives creating and the systemic risks associated with inappropriate bank risk-taking with respect to those products. And this, of course, in fact, vastly exaggerates, but as the initial step in terms of figuring out what the capital these internationally active banks had set out, it depended on what cubbyhole you slotted various products in. So if you had an interest rate product, an interest rate swap, you look at, in a sense, the interest rate kind of swap classification system. You looked at how long the maturity was in terms of the swap, right? Because obviously with longer maturity you have more potential exposure because of fluctuations. You look at the credit quality of the counterparty the bank entered into the interest rate swap with, right? And at that time, they assumed that, of course, sovereigns of all industrialized countries couldn't possibly default, so basically zero capital weight needed for those interest rate swaps, right? So for any particular derivative, you slotted it into a particular cubbyhole, right? Traditional kind of regulatory approach. Now, I basically argued in this 1989 paper that, in fact, this was incredibly vulnerable to modern financial innovation. Because what was missing in terms of how this approach, in material part, to deal with OTC derivatives, is that they were focusing simply on particular products, when, in fact, there's the other half of modern financial innovation, the underlying process through which products are invented, introduced to the marketplace, and diffused. And that the failure to consider the process of innovation is a real problem. That is that, basically, in the late 1980s, there emerged a completely new system for the introduction of complex new products, or just a mere fact of introduction of complex new products. At its most impressive, you had quants, rocket scientists, light bulb heads, right? Light bulbs go up over their heads. Of course, you call them something else when they lose a bunch of money for you. Relying on esoteric models laden with incomprehensible Greek letters, right? Developing these new products. And that this process is very dynamic, constant stream of new complicated products, and it has become central to the competition among the major financial institutions of the world. That, in a sense, the focus has moved away from the kind of the generalist investment banker, right? Tinkering, coming up with new products. And in the face of this process, this kind of standard cubbyhole approach doesn't work. Why? Well, number one, given the richness of modern financial innovation, how many very creative rocket scientists are at work, you have this incredible richness of possible products. And the kind of classification system you can't really accommodate the rich and the surprised. Remember, the Bank for International Settlements, in terms of this Basel Accord, focused just on currency swaps and interest rate swaps. Well, if you look at today's newspapers, you know, how often do people talk about the possible systemic risk problems associated with those two particular kinds of derivatives? Secondly, more importantly, in terms of the innovation process, it relates to information. That is, your reaction is, well, all you have to do is keep those boxes, keep the cubbyholes up to date. Well, there's a big problem. In terms of those cubbyholes, right, it depends on an incredible amount of knowledge on the part of regulators as to the particular risk-return characteristics for the bank offering those products. In effect, you have to model those different products, right? Well, under, you know, so the financial reform legislation here in the U.S. hasn't passed yet through both houses of Congress. But basically, generally speaking, up until now, in terms of the introduction of new OTC derivatives, banks nowhere near needs to register or otherwise notify regulators of the existence of the products, so that the regulators may not even know of the existence of many important financial products or strategies, much less know how to price these things and how to model these things. It's incredibly difficult to keep that kind of classification system approach up to date. That is, that the traditional kind of legal/regulatory approach to dealing with issues relating to financial innovation and possible kind of excessive risk taking on the part of banks or systemic risk caused by bank failure becomes very difficult. And interestingly, you know, so in terms of the reform legislation, one of the important aspects is, in a sense, that regulators would have a better sense in terms of what products are introduced and so forth. And at least the last time I looked, there was a provision for the creation of an informational clearinghouse. This is kind of one of the things that I had recommended in the 1993 Yale piece. But in contrast to this kind of the standard regulatory approach, setting up these classification system, if one focuses on compensation, right? You know, how compensation is determined, or thinking through how well-designed the system is, regulators, in effect, don't have to get into issues as much of how to precisely model particular products, or to necessarily be at a tremendous disadvantage in terms of not knowing particular products or strategies that financial institutions are engaged in. It requires much less information, and it's also much more incremental. That is, say that regulators adopt some kind of substantive limitation on compensation, okay, some in terms of guidance or whatever, or it could be, of course, well short of that in terms of greater disclosure of various compensation incentive schemes and the like. Say that regulators make a mistake, right? Charlie, I realize that you would be making this point, right? That just in case the regulator makes a mistake, right, you can actually reverse. It's much more reversible in terms of this kind of incremental approach, and that in this financial innovation area, because you worry about, just as you worry about financial institutions themselves making mistakes that can possibly hurt the institutions themselves and so forth, regulators have to keep in mind, you know, the possibility that they may be causing, you know, the possibility of them making mistakes that may have unanticipated consequences. And so that this kind of incrementalist approach does have some virtues, along with, you know, negatives, right? So you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. In addition, this kind of approach, in terms of thinking through the general, for instance, the general area of compensation, as opposed to going with a traditional classification-based regulatory approach, it's probably, or in addition to, okay, that's probably a better way of framing it, so that you have both belt and suspenders. It's probably a little bit more robust to the process of financial innovation, that even as new products are created and so forth, if you don't pay as much attention to the kind of compensation rules, disclosure, or substantive you've undertaken, not as worrisome in terms of it being on autopilot versus more substantive rules, okay? Okay, so the first, part of this little talk is focused on, why there are some virtues, I think, in terms of this, why looking at compensation systems is really quite interesting. It's a very attractive area to look at. The second kind of point I want to deal with, in a sense, is even in terms of compensation systems, one has to be careful in terms of taking thoughtful, measured, often incremental approaches, okay? That even within this kind of general incremental approach, to be very careful. And in terms of this, again, I want to focus in the area of complex financial products, financial innovation. In that 1993 Misunderstood Derivatives article, and it's available from I think the web page for this conference, I basically argued that even from the point of financial institutions, as we just heard, right, in the last panel, if you're talking about managers acting in a completely shareholder optimal way, they're probably taking more risk than is socially optimal, right? So I guess apart from New Zealand, I think New Zealand experimented for a couple of years with basically a laissez-faire approach to financial institutions. Most industrialized countries, for externalities and other reasons, intervene as to risk-taking of financial institutions in particular, right? And at least in the past in the US, right, the federal government really hasn't intervened too much as to other industries. Now, my claim in that 1993 piece is that in fact, in terms of financial institution decision-making with respect to risk as to these complex products, that in fact, the risks taken are more, even more, than what would be optimal from the point of view of diversified shareholders, okay? That is, in fact, from a diversified shareholder standpoint, there can be out-and-out mistakes in terms of just excessive, out-and-out mistakes, and often in the area of excessive risk. Now, why? That you normally assume, right, that if you're a big financial institution, lots of really smart people, and so forth, that presumptively they're sophisticated, and so that if anything, there may be a gap merely between what's shareholder optimal versus what's socially optimal. Why the claim that in this area, in terms of complex financial products, may be taking more risks than even is optimal for these shareholders? Well, I explored various factors. And one set of factors relates to the rational incentives based behavior of the people involved. Second class of factors relates to the irrational behavior of the people, the humans involved. And the third, a third area, there are a couple others, but I won't bore you with the whole litany, but a third area that I focused on was the peculiar nature of financial, quote, science, unquote, okay? So first, in terms of incentives-based, rational incentives-based behavior that could help cause this, one aspect I focused on was the incredibly asymmetric nature of the payoff structure in this space within the financial services institution, okay? That is, that very often, in terms of if you achieve true success in terms of introducing a new complicated OTC derivative, genuine success in terms of introducing the product, or at least the perception of success by your superior of a wonderful new financial product, you can literally make lifetime wealth. $10 million, $20 million. Look at the downside to that. Well, say that you're not so successful. Well, you might lose your job, suffer some reputational losses. But when you think about like a purely instrumental, ethically challenged person, that could be an awfully, awfully attractive lottery ticket. Right? And when you think about some more, right, in terms of this compensation structure, it's really like, and it relates so closely to the nature of the innovation process. Often, at least certainly back then, right, back years ago, things have changed a little bit, but back then, often the senior management at these financial institutions simply didn't understand the true risks and returns of the products that their underlings, their subordinates they're evaluating, really were taking on for the bank. And on top of that, very often, in terms of the kinds of risks that they would be taking on, would appear years later. And given the historically high turnover in this space, right, by the time the risks, the negatives, show up, you may be 3 banks away. So when you put some of these issues together, and so this is kind of a variation, kind of an extreme application of a kind of a short-termism type argument, all right? Second set of factors, so that's kind of, in a sense, could be for the, certainly, especially for the ethically challenged, could be, that the incentive structure in the context of this modern innovation process creates real problems. And in fact, it's been very difficult to deal with for everybody. A second set of factors is really based on kind of irrational behavior. So I basically argued that lots of cognitive biases, in fact, could cause real problems that would, in effect, result in too much risk being taken, okay? So that I focus on things like the availability effect and the related expert effect, right? So that is the availability effect we all know, right? We tend to exaggerate the importance of whatever we know best, right? So that if you are a lawyer in this room, right, law is everything, right? Law is the fount, whereas the economist in the room, would think that economics drives everything, right? And of course, we all know that in terms of the staff, what really drives everything is good food. So we tend to exaggerate the importance of what we know best. And the related, sorry, beg your pardon, I conjoin 2 concepts. The availability effect, if you can recall something very quickly, right? That is, you hear of an airplane crash, you exaggerate the importance of the how likely an airplane is going to crash. The very related effect of the expert effect, we tend to exaggerate the importance of what we know best, right? Well, I pointed out how the availability expert effects in this derivatives area, for instance, cause these quants. Remember, like whatever can't be quantified, hey, it might not be important. So that I pointed out how, for instance, in terms of some of these the modeling in the derivatives area, they didn't take into account enough legal risks. And I don't need to remind this crowd, for instance, in terms of the importance of, in a sense, consideration of legal risks, right, in light of what has happened in the past 2 years. I also pointed out, in terms of as another cognitive bias in this 1993 article, the tendency to ignore low probability catastrophic events, and showed, for instance, how, in fact, I found certain manuals, certain instructions in terms of to basically teach financial engineers how to model, where I found explicit language telling them to ignore those crazy events. Okay. Third set of factors I focused on was the peculiar nature of financial science. Okay? This actually relates to this incentive thing, believe it or not. So that Robert C. Merton, that is, Robert K. Merton, the father of Robert C. Merton, the great sociologist, wrote some path-breaking articles on the nature of science, true science, like math, physics, okay? And so, he basically set up various norms having to do with true science. So that one of his norms was the norm of universalism. That is, it doesn't matter your social station, your personal attributes, whatever your theory is tested on its own grounds. So remember there have been reports about that person in Moscow who has turned down some kind of $1 million prize, even though he has come close to solving Fermat's last theorem. Of course, there's only 4 people who can evaluate that. So I have a secret theory that they're really conspiring to make up this story and sharing the pot. But leaving that aside, so remember that guy. It doesn't matter that he lives in Moscow, is apparently very antisocial, lives with his sister, crap apartment, and is not even interested in $1 million. The fact that he came up with it is irrelevant. Well, let's think about, so it's an illustration of universalism. How about, though, the situation where the same fellow came out with the absolute best way of modeling the risks and returns, the pricing of a particular OTC derivative? Is that person's model, at least initially, going to be as important as a too-big-to-fail bank's model for how to price the derivative in terms of the pricing of that derivative in the marketplace? In terms of these kinds of issues, they actually relate to, we saw the many controversies in terms of what the notion of value is. Mark to market, mark to model, mark to myth. Ultimately, it's a first cousin. I mean, it relates to these kinds of issues. And if you can't really figure out, for instance, the true value, whatever true means in this context, of this peculiar financial science, how exactly do adjust for risk in deciding on compensation? Right? So in terms of, now I want to talk a little bit about, in terms of, I guess, my current little stint at the SEC, and a few examples of where the SEC has tried to take some steps in this space in the past couple of months. For instance, in terms of something most directly related to the theme of this conference, in December, there were basically a series of changes adopted by the SEC to compensation and related disclosures, so that this December change in SEC policy basically emphasized the need for better disclosure of compensation policies, procedures that present material risks to the company. So this release, this is a public release issued in December, set out as illustrative examples of issues potentially appropriate for the company to address. And I'm using the release's wording. So, for instance, how the company's compensation policies and practices relate to realization of risk, short-term and long-term, such as through possible clawbacks, right? Or another illustrative example that the release offered, in terms of a possible area to look at is when compensation is structured significantly differently from other units within the company, right? Presumably, bank tellers do not have the same asymmetric payoff structure. Third, when there are departures very significantly from overall risk and reward structure, and when the bonuses are awarded upon accomplishment of a task, while the income and risk to the company from this may extend significantly over a significantly longer period of time. I was literally scribbling out this little talk at a park bench in Morningside Park just before, and my scribbles got particularly difficult here. Sorry. So those are, for instance, some of the compensation issues, directly related to, the theme of the conference and financial innovation. But let me speak more broadly in terms of incentive structures and what the SEC has done recently relating to financial risk. So that, let me give you another illustration. In terms of the board's role, okay, in terms of risk oversight, so this is kind of a process point rather than just necessarily the actual kind of disclosure, the compensation, certain aspects of the compensation. The idea is that requiring disclosure of the extent to which risks arise from compensation policies that are reasonably likely to have a material adverse impact on the company, and disclose such policies and procedures and so forth. So the idea, hopefully, is that not very many companies would disclose that they have such seriously flawed systems. And this is intended to encourage a greater focus on, in part, a greater focus on competition mechanisms. Going even further, interpreting kind of this incentive structure even more broadly, Jeff had noted that one of the areas that I was concerned about was the inappropriability problem. That is, because any particular firm could not capture all the benefits of the research and development it might do to understand a particular complex product, they might not do enough to really understand the true risks and returns. Well, as we know, there's been a lot of talk in the press and elsewhere about excessive reliance on the part of institutional investors on credit ratings when they went and bought various mortgage-backed securities, including very complicated mortgage-backed securities. It's very difficult to, in fact, do the research and development for any institutional investor to understand the true risks and returns of those products. Among other things, in terms of the typical disclosure documents associated with these asset-backed securities, in terms of the various tranches associated with, the mortgage-backed, a particular mortgage-backed security, and I'm sure an investment banker will come up with a reason why all 100 tranches are socially necessary, but I'll leave that to investment bankers. I do point out I keep on asking, but I've yet to meet an investment bank who quite come up with a convincing argument for the social value of LIBOR squared interest rate swaps. Okay, but leaving that aside. So if you look at the 100 tranches, right? If you look at the 100 tranches, it's very hard to, in fact, even figure out what would happen to the various tranches in case there were certain cash flows projections, because the various disclosure documents basically were verbal. You had to spend a lot of time and money converting those verbal descriptions of what would happen in terms of what each tranche would receive, do the programming, hope that, in fact, your interpretation is correct, do it probably is, in fact, quite complex, right? Translating from words to mathematical formula, right? Patrick maybe could help on that sort of thing in terms of, there's a possibility of garbling, right? And so that it's enormously expensive, in a sense, to do it on your own, to figure out the various tranches and so forth and the impact on cash flows and the like. About 2 months ago, the SEC issued a concept release, issued a proposed release, raising the idea, so this is not a rule, but raising the idea of requiring computer downloadable depictions of the waterfalls. of the tranches, so that you, an institutional investor, could literally download that computer code, plug in whatever projections you want, and immediately figure out what the impact will be on your tranche. And then how does this relate to the interoperability issue? You basically reduce the cost, right? So in fact, it's almost costless to do this. You can do much more investigation, right? You don't have to rely as much on outsiders, credit ratings agencies, or relying on commercial services who do the kind of translating the mathematical form. Or another example, in terms of incentive structure and financial services. The money market fund industry is an integral part of our financial system, right? They're a very important part, multi-trillion-dollar part of the shadow banking system. In terms of incentive structures, let's think about that. In normal circumstances, all these money market funds trade at $1, right? The reason they trade at $1 in normal circumstances is basically through an accounting fiction, amortized cost. Okay, you don't look at the true market value of these products. Well, when you think about that, and of course this is just a first-order depiction, ignoring lots of refinements, but when you think about it, if your share price is always basically, the actual share price is always going to be $1, right? Wouldn't you be tempted in some ways to get basically invest in the maximum risky portfolio subject to the constraints that we impose on money market funds, as long as you can stay within that $1? But in fact, there are differences between how aggressive some money market funds versus others. How do you deal with this kind of incentive structure problem, right? It's a very important incentive structure problem. So what we did a couple of months ago in terms of money market, this was actually adopted, and this is just the first stage in dealing with money market funds, is we basically require in a disclosure on a lagged basis your true market value. So that is, so that investors will see, are some funds always like 0.9999? I think we asked for 4 digits, okay? 0.999? Or are some funds constantly hovering below that, barely avoiding breaking the $1, right? So that is, and we do that with a lag, of course, because we don't want among other things, we don't want runs, right? If you require the daily disclosure of that sort of thing, among other issues, apart from departing from the traditional $1 a share trading price, you worry about the possible gaming, right? If you get close, that some sophisticated investors may be tempted to, pull tons out. Okay. In conclusion, the theme of executive compensation and risk-taking is indeed important and holds real promise. Especially, I would wager, in the area of complex products, financial innovation, that a lot of people think may have played a major role in terms of the current financial crisis. And strides are being made. Fascinating academic papers. I read a whole bunch of the academic papers posted in connection with just fascinating stuff. But I want to urge that the failure to come up with an all-encompassing grand theory of optimal compensation, that's not really necessary, not really critical. Woody Allen, again, the only philosopher I read, once said, can we actually know the universe? My God, it's hard enough finding your way in Chinatown. Especially now that I'm in government, at least temporarily, and don't always have the time to necessarily think about things carefully, I would welcome directions to help find the way. And I don't necessarily need a theory of the universe. As Bruce pointed out, right? This is hard stuff. This is really difficult. Academics have the smarts, have the time, and the creativity. They are almost uniquely suited to provide directions in this area. Thank you so much for hearing me out. Appreciate it.
So I think we have a few minutes, do we, Bruce, to put some issues to Henry. And so here's one. I'll start. So one of the themes that came out of the second panel today was at least the suggestion that shareholder power might in fact be counterproductive when it came to executive compensation. That either because of a clientele effect or perhaps because of a governance effect, at least in the financial area, the shareholders might have reasons to encourage excessive compensation associated with excessive risk-taking. Now, the SEC is all about the shareholders, and indeed you have a lot of proposals on offer that would increase the shareholder power, and it looks like the reform bill will give you more latitude in that dimension. So to what extent do you see a need to balance off the traditional concerns that the SEC has always had when it came to looking out for the interests of investors with the systemic concerns that at least the second panel suggested might flow from thinking about from increasing the shareholder power without at least a great deal of thought?
Well, in fact, this is an incredibly rich issue. In terms of, it's rich because it involves not just federal law issues, but state law issues. So that I heard some talk, unfortunately I didn't get a chance to hear the full presentation, but I heard some talk about focusing on credit default spreads and the like, and others have talked, for instance, in early writings about focusing on the interests of bondholders and so forth. That implicates the central aspect of the Anglo-American law of corporations. What is the objective of the corporation? And I think I worry a little bit that in terms of focusing on the interests of, in terms of bondholders or others, how that matches up with this kind of central core objective. Elsewhere, back when I was a crazy academic, so speaking as a crazy academic as opposed to a crazy regulator, speaking as a crazy academic, as we know in the 2008 Columbia article, Jay Westbrook and I, my colleague Jay Westbrook and I argued that even when you came close in the vicinity of insolvency, you should basically not care about the interests of bondholders. Granted, that's in the general corporation context, not the financial institution context. But so that I think, but some of the kinds of arguments have the similar force in the financial institutions area. That is one of the kind of the basic novel argument we had in terms of that piece, as opposed to the usual ambiguity, uncertainty type argument. The basic argument we had is Delaware has set up basically a system that's really designed to focus on shareholders in terms of the way voting is allocated, and certainly in terms of the way the market for corporate control and so forth. You have a particular system basically geared to the interests of shareholders. You do have this other system focused on, in fact, bondholders and creditors and so forth. That's called the bankruptcy system. You can't mix and match the two. That if you mix and match the two, you have a real dissonance between kind of means and ends. In terms of the financial institution context, of course, it becomes more difficult. It becomes more difficult in terms of how you address these concerns, because ideally the CEO is of a shareholder-oriented financial institution would want to maximize shareholder wealth subject to the constraints imposed by law. And the issue is, imposing the right constraints. And in terms of that issue, that again is enormously rich, because as Milton Friedman pointed out, the safest place in the world is a jail cell. Of course, we have to update it and say, it's a jail cell in New Hampshire, perhaps, okay? Not in California, Los Angeles. But the notion is, well, gee, what amount of risk really is appropriate from a society standpoint for a financial institution? We could, we could demand huge amounts of capital in all cash, right? All cash locked in safe deposit box. But is that what we really want? Don't we want lending? What is the right level of risk? It's not necessarily a situation where, you don't have any bank failures. Third aspect, in terms of this kind of, some SEC stuff in this area, we have to be sensitive to a number of these notions. And in terms of the short-term versus long-term issue, there is some discussion, for instance, in the recent rule we adopted limiting short sales to a particular, in a very, very, short selling in a very, very limited way. And there's discussion in that release about, in a sense, the SEC's views on concerns for long-term shareholders versus more short-term shareholders. So it's a very long-winded answer to a very rich question.
Another question? Bruce.
What question?
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Going back to the concept of corporate law.
Yes.
And take it to financial institutions. Deposit is a debt. Then what is the objective of the board? Should debt should be considered as debt in some sense? Are the board responsible to protect depositors and taxpayers in that context? So somehow, I want to say, what are the challenges that, society faces in terms of safety and soundness and systemic risk? So what do we do? What's your thought on that?
In terms of that area, for instance, in terms of U.S. law, it's kind of interesting. Say you were talking about a very large, sophisticated money center bank, right? The typical structure is the bank and then the holding company, right? At the bank level, in fact, because of various federal and other banking laws, there are limitations in terms of that directors are forced to engage in safe and sound banking behavior, whereas at the financial kind of holding company level, in a sense, is more loose. It's more focused on, in a sense, shareholder wealth optimization, subject to various constraints. So it's a very, very difficult issue, and one suspects as a purely empirical matter, right? If you look at the annual reports of major financial institutions, at least in this country, right? At least the first 40 pages of the 200 or 300 pages, right? The narrative part, you get the sense that pre-crisis, most financial institutions would probably claim to be trying to, in effect, further shareholder wealth subject to some kind of, safety and soundness constraint. I mean, when you say, roughly speaking, I think that's the basic message they try to convey. But that's as empirical as that. Well, thank you again so much. Really appreciate it.